contemporary argument by two authors, David Bentley Hart and Robert Spitzer, and this is called the Unconditioned Reality argument. So that's what we're going to look at, for the next bit. So we're now going to look at a more recent argument for the existence of God, which has come from these two authors. And this is called the Unconditioned Reality argument. So they begin with definitions. So the first thing, and this is similar to Ibn Sina's argument, but it's still a different argument. So the first thing is they define a conditioned reality. And a conditioned reality, according to them, is any reality, a particle, a wave, physical laws of nature, whatever it is, any reality which, during the time that it exists, is dependent upon another reality for its existence. And the example that they give often of a conditioned reality is a cat. So if you have a cat, that cat, as and when it exists, it is dependent upon its cells and the structure of its cells. But then those cells in the cat, those cells are conditioned realities too. They depend on molecules and the structure, the molecular structure of those molecules. Molecules are also a conditioned reality. They depend on atoms and the structure of those atoms. And an atom is also a conditioned reality. It depends on protons and other things. Protons too. So what this is basically saying is that, we have certain things in the known world that as they exist, in order to exist, they depend on other things. And you could draw this sort of dependency tree for many, many things that we know about. I actually already gave you the example of myself. My existence right now is dependent on a whole host of things. So a cat is a conditioned reality. I'm a conditioned reality. You're a conditioned reality. This computer is a conditioned reality, and so on and so forth. And then they also define a second thing, second term called unconditioned reality. And unconditioned reality is any reality that does not depend on another reality to exist. Right? So an unconditioned reality, it exists independently or self-sufficiently. And according to many classical theologies, this is the concept of God. And we'll actually see how that really works out. Now, the first part of this argument simply says that in the real world, in the world as we know it, there are some conditioned realities. We don't need to know about the whole universe to know that some conditioned realities exist. David Bentley Hart makes this point in his book. Right? He says that, one is dependent on an incalculable number of even greater and smaller finite conditions, some of which are temporal and some of which are definitely not. And all those conditions themselves depend on further conditions. So he goes on to talk about how, we ourselves, we are made up of parts, right? We're made up of parts. Our parts are made up of smaller parts, and so on and so forth. You could trace it all the way down to the quantum level if you want. And if you sort of zoom out from there, we're part of a wider ecosystem of different conditioned realities, and so on and so forth. So what David Bentley Hart tells us is, and this is a very non-controversial statement, that all the physical reality is filled with conditioned realities. So we certainly know some conditioned realities exist. From that fact, from the fact that conditioned realities exist in the world, what the argument is going to try to do is we're going to try to see is there such thing as an unconditioned reality, right? So does an unconditioned reality exist? That's what this argument is trying to prove. It's trying to prove that if conditioned realities exist, then an unconditioned reality also exists. So here's how it's done. So if you think about this, you have the two definitions, right? Conditioned reality, that which depends on other things to exist, and then unconditioned reality, that which does not depend on anything else to exist. Those are your definitions. We know conditioned realities exist. I think everybody would agree with that. I think science has shown us that. Do unconditioned realities exist? We don't know. That's what the argument is for. And they these authors, they use something what called a disjunction. So here's what they do. So Robert Spitzer tells us in his book, this is a graphic from his book. He says that there are, for all of reality, there's only two options. Option one, which we'll call P, we'll call it scenario P. According to option one, there are no unconditioned realities in all of reality. Only conditioned realities exist. Okay, so option one, this, you could call this the atheist scenario. There are only conditioned realities in all of reality. There are no unconditioned realities. So we'll call that P. Option two is there are conditioned realities, and there is at least one unconditioned reality in existence. At least one. There, at this point, there could be 10, I don't know, but there's at least one. Right? There's at least one reality that exists that doesn't depend on anything else. So we'll call that Q. So we have scenario P and we have scenario Q. Now, these two options, these two scenarios, they are, you could say, they're logical opposites, or they're like contradictory. So this scenario is the total opposite of this one. What that means is that if this is true, then this is false. And if this is true, so if P is true, Q is false. If Q is true, then P is false, because they're opposites. And how do we actually know which option is correct? That is the question, right? Is P correct? Is P true or is Q true? Here's how we could go about it. So one thing we could do, one way to investigate this, we could try to go find an unconditioned reality. We can get in a spaceship, we can get a microscope, we can start looking all over, we could try to look at the quantum level, we could try to go, do a Star Trek thing and explore the galaxy, and we can go searching for an unconditioned reality, and if you found one, then you would know Q is true. That's one way to do it. Obviously, we can't do that, right? We don't even have the technology to do such a thing. Is there any other way to decide whether P is true or Q is true? Now, what we do know is these are opposite, they're contradictory. So if one is proven true, the other is false. But it's also the case, logically speaking, that if I can prove one of these to be false, the other one will be true. That's just pure logic. So this is called the disjunctive syllogism, and that's how we're actually going to do it. So we have P or Q, right? P or Q. If I can show that P is false, what you call not P, then Q is true. So if I can disprove the claim that only conditioned realities exist, if I disprove that, it will be true, logically speaking, that at least one unconditioned reality exists. And this would not be a probability-based conclusion. It would actually be a logically certain conclusion. That's what the rules of logic tell us. So you have P or Q. If they're logical opposites, not P would mean yes Q. Similarly, not Q would mean yes P. So this is the strategy. So because we don't have the technology and it's probably impossible to go tour the universe to find an unconditioned reality, because who knows, there could be realities beyond our universe, we don't know. It's better we actually try to use logical deduction and investigate scenario P. So that's what we'll do. And scenario P can work out in two ways. Again, this is from Robert Spitzer's book. It could be that there is only, in all of reality, it could be that there's only a finite number of conditioned realities. So there's only conditioned realities, but there's only a finite number. That's one option. Another option in scenario P, it could be that there are an infinite number of conditioned realities in reality. That could also be true. So we need to investigate both of those. We need to see if any of these are actually true or not. Of course, if we can prove that P is true, then Q would be false, and then we're done. Similarly, if we prove that P is false, then Q would be true. So let's check it out. So let's begin with scenario PF, so finite P. That would mean in all of reality, you have a finite number of conditioned realities only. All right, so what that would mean is something like this. If you take the cat as the example, so the cat depends on cells and the structure of cells. That depends on molecules, which depend on atoms, which depends on protons, which depend on quarks. Let's say it keeps going until some number, any number, right? 50, 100, whatever it is, some finite number. So we reach the xth, or the last conditioned reality in the chain. Now, after the last one, there are no more conditioned realities. We're done. We ran out of them. Now, the problem here is once you've reached the xth conditioned reality, where x is the last one, doesn't matter what the number is, that conditioned reality, the last one, would actually need some other thing to depend on, because it's a conditioned reality, right? This is the scenario of conditioned realities only. There's no unconditioned reality. So you only have conditioned realities, and there's a finite number, so you're at the last level of them, and the last one it depends on something else to exist, but you're out. It's the last one. So actually, the last conditioned reality cannot exist because it has nothing, it has no cause to keep it in existence because it's the last one. So this last one will not exist. And if the last conditioned reality does not exist, everything above it, because these all depend on it, they will not exist either. So the scenario that there are only a finite number of conditioned realities, the way it actually works out logically is that no conditioned realities actually exist. So that scenario actually leads to the existence of nothing. Nothing exists. But if you look around here right now, things clearly do exist. And what this means is we have a contradiction between this scenario and actual reality. And that tells us that this scenario, finite number of conditioned realities in all of reality, is false because we ran into a contradiction. So logically speaking, what this means is that the idea that there could only be a finite number of conditioned realities is false. It's impossible. It's logically impossible. There's no such thing. Now, we can be a little smarter and we can say, well, instead of having a hierarchy of realities, what if we do it like this? What if we have a finite number of conditioned realities and they exist in a circle? So the last one, x, depends on the first one. That seems to be a good solution to the problem, right? The issue here ultimately is this. If CR1 depends on 2, 2 depends on 3, all the way depends on x, and x depends on 1 again, it really means that CR1 depends to exist on itself. Okay, what's wrong with that? The problem here is CR1 is a conditioned reality. A conditioned reality, by definition, cannot cause itself to exist, and it can't depend on itself. To be conditioned reality means to depend on something else. So therefore, this scenario, a circular chain of conditioned realities only, it's impossible. It would result in the existence of nothing. But if you look around, things do exist. So this scenario, it cannot be true. So we can sort of fill in. Hypothesis F, finite number of conditions, is false. It's just not possible. Logically speaking, it's not possible. Okay, so now let's go to the next one. Let's check infinite number of conditioned realities. Maybe that's a better solution. So that would mean that in all, this is the next scenario. There is only an infinite number of conditioned realities in existence. There's no unconditioned reality. That's what this means. So, we'll look something like this. You have this chain, A depends on B depends on C depends on D. It goes on for infinitely. Each one depends on the next one in an infinite chain. Now, this seems to be promising. It goes on forever. An infinite chain of conditioned realities, an infinite chain of dependence. But keep in mind, and this is why I pointed out before, right? The causation that we're talking about here is not, this chain of causation is not about temporal causation. So we're not talking about an infinite sequence of time. We are talking about a dependence that is happening in every moment of time. So conditioned reality A, at every moment it exists, it depends on conditioned reality B. So whether there is a Big Bang or not is irrelevant. Even if the universe from a time perspective has always existed, that's irrelevant to what's happening here. Rather, at every time period, in every moment, conditioned reality A depends on conditioned reality B, and B depends on C, and C depends on D, and so on. So this dependence is simultaneous for the whole series. If that's the case, right, this dependence is simultaneous. We're not talking about temporal causation. With simultaneous dependence, this set of infinite series by itself, it still cannot exist. No conditioned reality in the infinite series of conditions is ever fulfilled, because none of the members of this series have the power to exist on their own. So even an infinite number of them, no member can actually give existence to the next one, because it doesn't even possess it itself. Think about it. If you start with finite number of conditioned realities and you keep upping the number, 1,000, 1,000,000, a billion, 100 billion. It doesn't matter how many conditioned realities you have. If that's all you have, you still end up with the existence of nothing when you're talking about finite. So as n goes to infinity, your result doesn't change. Even if you look at it from a different perspective, if this entire set, the set of infinite conditioned realities, the whole totality of it, if you bring it all together, that is still a conditioned reality. It's not like the totality of infinite conditioned reality somehow equals an unconditioned reality. Even if we wanted that to be the case, it couldn't be the case, simply because it would mean that this unconditioned reality that you constructed is dependent on all these conditioned realities. So that can't be the case. You can't add up conditioned realities to infinity and somehow we end up with something that exists on its own. That's not possible. So in the end, even the idea that there is only an infinite number of conditioned realities in all of existence, that is logically impossible as well. It's logically impossible. Where does that leave us then? Well, if we go back to our little thing here, so the scenario of there is only a finite number of conditioned realities in all reality, that is false. Logically speaking, it's false. We disproved it. The scenario that there's an infinite number of conditioned realities in all of reality only, that is also false. Therefore, the whole of scenario P that we see here, we've actually, just using logic, right? I don't have to go in a spaceship and examine dark matter, or I don't have to do that to know that the scenario of only conditioned realities and no unconditioned reality, that scenario is false. logic alone allows us to conclude that scenario P, no unconditioned realities, only conditioned realities, is not true. Now, if we go back to this, we've just proven that scenario P as a whole is not true. So we have P or Q, and then not P. So P false, therefore Q, which means this has shown that if it is false that only conditioned realities exist in all of reality, it is logically true that at least one unconditioned reality must exist. This is simply the logic of the disjunctive syllogism. These are the rules of logic. Now, keep in mind, what did we already point out? The rules of logic don't depend on science. Rather, science depends on the rules of logic. So what science has to say about the universe, completely irrelevant to the argument being made here. And also, again, this is about conditioned versus unconditioned realities. It makes no difference whether the material universe began with the Big Bang or whether it always existed. All of that doesn't matter. This argument is just as effective for an eternal universe, because even if you have a universe that lasts forever, that universe is still populated by conditioned realities. So the question still remains, can you only have conditioned realities in all of reality, or do you need at least one unconditioned reality? And the rules of logic pretty much lead to the conclusion that there must be at least one unconditioned reality in all of reality. So now let's move forward. So we took two routes here. Avicenna's argument, based on what I showed you, concluded with there has to be at least one necessary being in reality. We tried to avoid it, but that's where we ended up. David Bentley Hart and Robert Spitzer's argument has also concluded at this point that there's at least one unconditioned reality in all of reality. So now both arguments are sort of parked at the same spot. There's at least one necessary being or one unconditioned reality. Now we can actually move forward, because if somebody watching this is thinking, well, this is all very interesting, but for all we know, the necessary being or the unconditioned reality, it just could be a black hole. It could be, it could be an atom. It could be like a particle. At this point, you could be right. We don't know anything yet about what this unconditioned reality is. It just could be some material substance. So you're absolutely right. And at this stage in the argument, there's no reason to think that the unconditioned reality corresponds to what we call God. We're not there yet. There are further steps. So here's what they are. So to begin, there's at least one unconditioned reality or one necessary being in existence. There's at least one. For all we know, there could be 10, there could be a billion unconditioned realities, there could be an infinite number of unconditioned realities. I don't know. But let's see what we can find out about unconditioned realities based on the fact that at least one exists. That's what we've shown. So by definition, any unconditioned reality is uncaused, right? Unconditioned reality, necessary being, it exists, but it doesn't rely on anything to exist. So it doesn't have any cause. It is uncaused, it is causeless. That's uncontroversial. That's what we've shown. That's what the arguments have shown. Following from this fact, it follows, if the unconditioned reality is uncaused, if it has no cause, it would also mean that any unconditioned reality is absolutely simple. In other words, it does not have any parts. It's not made up of parts of any kind. Why is that the case? Well, two philosophers and others have said that if the unconditioned reality, or if the first cause, as Farabi says, if it had parts that made it up, that would mean that it is caused by those parts. That's the argument. So if an unconditioned reality consisted of parts, right, components, then it would be dependent on those components, and the parts that make it up, they would be its cause. Okay, so what's wrong with that? Well, the only problem here is that if an unconditioned reality was dependent on its parts, and if it was caused by its parts, it's not really an unconditioned reality. It would be a conditioned reality. And we might say, okay, fine, let it be a conditioned reality. Who cares? Well, that's fine, but the argument just showed that at least one unconditioned reality exists. So whatever those unconditioned realities are, they don't have any parts. Right? So every unconditioned reality, even if there's 10 of them, they would have no parts. They have no parts because they have no cause. An unconditioned reality has no cause because it is an unconditioned reality. It doesn't depend on any conditions. So following from this, that every unconditioned reality has no parts, it would further follow that if you had more than one unconditioned reality, if you had 2, if you had 4, if you had any number of them, each of these unconditioned realities would have to possess something, some feature, some property that the other unconditioned realities don't have. Does that make sense? So let's start with 2. So let's say there's 2 unconditioned realities. You are 1, you are 2, right? Let's say there's 2 of them. If there really are 2 of them, each of these would have to consist, because they have to be different in some way. If there's no difference between them at all, then there's really only one. So they have to be different. And if they were different from each other, they would have to have something in common, and they would each have to have something that the other didn't have. So each of these unconditioned realities, if there's 2 unconditioned realities, they would each be made up of a common part and a different part, right? A shared nature and a differentia, if you will. That would mean that if there's 2 of them, each unconditioned reality or each necessary being would actually be composed of parts, right? So the only way you can have 2 unconditioned realities is if both of them are composed of parts, a common part and a differential part, some differentiating features. Okay, what is wrong? What's the problem with that? Let us have 2. The problem with that is any unconditioned reality that is composed of parts is not really an unconditioned reality. So is it possible to have 2 or more unconditioned realities? It's actually not possible for the reasons we've explained. If there were 2, they would have parts, and actually they would be conditioned realities. So we are forced, by the force of logic, we have to conclude that from the previous step, there is at least one unconditioned reality. There is at least one necessary being. This analysis shows that there's actually only one single, simple, unconditioned reality. That is just what the logical deduction leads you to. But why? Well, it's because any unconditioned reality has no cause, therefore it has no parts. And if it has no parts, there can only be one. If there are 2 or more, it would require common and differential components in the unconditioned reality. And if that were the case, it would be conditioned. Therefore, there cannot be 2 unconditioned realities. There's only one unconditioned reality. So now there's one of them. Now we can talk about the unconditioned reality or the necessary being. So moving forward, knowing that there's only one and that it has no parts, right? No parts whatsoever. So what does it mean? So we call that simplicity. People call this simplicity. So The necessary being the unconditioned reality is simple, right? Because it has no parts, it has no inner parts, it's not made up of anything. And we're not just talking about material parts, it couldn't have any metaphysical parts either. So hypothetically speaking, whatever this unconditioned reality is, it can't be like a combination of Platonic ideas or Platonic forms. It can't be made up of thoughts. It can't be made up of information, because all of that contains multiplicity. So Robert Spitzer has a very good explanation of what simplicity would mean in this context. He defines simplicity as without intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries, which is a very good definition of simplicity. Because if you think about it, something that has no differentiation from within or from without, if you had such a reality, it would be unbounded. It wouldn't be bound by anything. It has no differentiation, right? It has no parts. So nothing could infringe on this reality. So that would mean the unconditioned reality is both simple without parts and therefore unbounded. Infinite could be another word, but I'd rather use the word unbounded or unrestricted. What do we mean by boundaries? So Robert Spitzer gives this good example. So the boundaries are of any particular thing are generally, it's those boundaries make something what it is. The boundaries of a conditioned reality make that reality different from other conditioned realities. So for example, he explains that the boundaries of squares exclude the boundaries of circles. So squares are squares and circles are circles because they have different bounds. You can't squares. You can't have like something that's both square and circle. You can't have a shape that's both. It's either one or the other. Similarly, the boundaries of what makes an electron excludes the boundaries of what makes something a proton. Something cannot be an electron and a proton at the same time because the boundaries of each are different. The boundaries of waves exclude the boundaries of particles. So the attributes, the properties of waves are different from the properties of particles, and something cannot be a wave and a particle at the same time and place. So Robert Spitzer tells us that if you look at these examples, waves versus particles, right? They're mutually exclusive because they're bounded. But an electron, this is the example he gives, an electron can behave as a particle in some conditions, and it behaves as a wave in other conditions. It's never both at the same time, but in one situation it's a wave, in another it's a particle. You've heard of the double slit experiment and all this stuff. Why is that the case? Well, he tells us, Robert Spitzer tells us, that this is because the electron in and of itself is simpler and less bounded than waves and particles. So an electron is a simpler, less bounded reality than waves and particles. And that's why the electron itself, it's not limited to being a wave or a particle. In one context, it manifests as a wave, in another as a particle. Similarly, Robert Spitzer writes that although electrons and protons are different, right? They're not the same thing. They can't be the same thing. An electromagnetic field allows for protons and electrons to interact because an electromagnetic field is simpler and less bounded than electrons and protons. So what's happening here is you have certain conditioned realities that they're bounded and their bounds are mutually exclusive, but then there's another kind of conditioned reality that is less bounded than both, and the electron is able to accommodate the boundaries of waves and particles. The electromagnetic field is able to accommodate the boundaries of electrons and protons. That's what these are just analogies and examples. In other words, a simpler, less bounded reality is compatible with, inclusive of, and capable of accommodating, hosting, or sustaining a less simple, more bounded reality. That is what these examples are showing. Another example of so that is what it means to be simple, right? Or unbounded. That which is more simple and more unbounded is ultimately more compatible with, more inclusive of, and more capable of hosting or sustaining things that are less simple and more bounded. That makes sense. Another example of simplicity, to use a non-physical example, is we have different thoughts in our mind, right? We can think about many different things, and each thought is very focused on its content, right? One thought could be about something, and the next thought is about something else. One thought can't really contain everything, but so our thoughts have bounds. But the act of thinking we're able to accommodate many thoughts when we think, right? We are able to think many different kinds of thoughts. You're not restricted to thinking only about one thing. So the act of thinking is simpler, it's more inclusive than specific thoughts. So that's another example of simplicity. Now, what does all this mean? Well, what this tells us, and these are just the examples. So this unconditioned reality, there's only one unconditioned reality, and we know it has no parts, so it has no boundaries. It's totally simple. And therefore, this unconditioned reality, it would be total oneness, if you think about it. Because it has no boundaries, it has no, it has no parts, it would be absolute unity. It would be completely one. It would be more one than, the number one. It would transcend all duality, the unconditioned reality, whatever it is, right? It would be a unitary reality, and it would be a transcendent reality because it is both simple, it has no differentiation, and because it's simple, it has no bounds. So it's absolutely transcendent. One scholar named Aziz Ismail has talked about this in one of his articles. Referring to the unconditioned reality, he says that this ultimate reality is often conceived as transcendent or described as, quote, he who is above all else. And what does that mean, he who is above all else? Right? We often encounter this symbolism when people talk about God. God is above everything, right? God is transcendent. We are tempted to interpret that in spatial terms. We think that means God is sort of physically outside the universe. But in this case, the notion of transcendence doesn't simply mean that. As Ismail says, this reality is called he who is above all else, not because it is a reality spatially above the human habitat, but because it is above, i.e., goes beyond or transcends all human categories. Being free from and prior to the dichotomy, duality, between subject and object, it is therefore also outside the frame of human discourse. So when people say that unconditional reality or God or whatever is transcendent, this is what it would mean. Transcendent in the sense of unbounded and absolutely simple, not transcendent in a spatial sense. So that being the case, if this simple, unbounded, unconditioned reality if it exists, that would also mean that, remember, simpler realities are less bounded, and a simpler reality is compatible with and capable of sustaining bounded realities. So therefore, this unconditioned reality, which is absolutely simple and absolutely unbounded, it would be compatible with and capable of sustaining all bounded conditioned realities. Right? So the existence of the unconditioned reality, it does not compete with, or you could say it doesn't cause other conditioned realities to cease to exist. Rather, because it is so simple and unbounded, the unconditioned reality would easily accommodate the existence of all other finite, conditioned realities. That's the point being made, and this is the argument that Robert Spitzer makes. So let's sort of put things together. Where are we now? So we're at this point where there is a single, simple, unbounded conditioned reality. There's only one. And the next thing that follows is whatever this reality is, because somebody may ask, well, how do we know it's not a particle? But whatever the reality is, it has to be immaterial. Why? Well, all material objects, particles, waves, molecules, atoms, quantum fields, whatever it is, they all are conditioned by space, time, extension, and position. Right? All material reality is conditioned by material qualities. Even at the quantum level, right? Even at the quantum level, position is still described in probabilistic terms using a wave function, for example. So that quality of position and time is still there. The limits are still there. So anything material is limited. And if it's limited, it would also be composed of certain parts, because if you don't have parts, there would be no limitation. For that reason, because all material realities are limited and constrained and composed of parts, the unconditioned reality has to be immaterial. It has to transcend materiality. That's one point. The second point, the unconditioned reality would also have to be eternal. Now, the word eternal tends to have two meanings, right? One meaning of eternal means it exists for an infinite amount of time. That's one meaning. Eternal here means something different. Eternal here doesn't mean lasting an infinite amount of time. Eternal here would mean utterly transcending time and change, which is to say that the unconditioned reality is beyond time. It doesn't go through time, and it doesn't change. It is immutable. This is what David Bentley Hart explains in his book. Referring to this as God, he says, God is eternal, not in the sense of possessing limitless duration, but in the sense of transcending time altogether. If you think about this very closely, if the unconditioned reality was within time, that would be changing. It would be a changing reality. And if it's changing, that would mean it is limited, because if it can change into something else, that means it was lacking something before. And if it can change, some part of it would stay the same and some part of it would change. So it would be composed of parts. If any of that were the case, the unconditioned reality would not be an unconditioned reality, it would be a conditioned reality. But the only conclusion one could draw is that the unconditioned reality is eternal, it transcends time. So if we add this all up, what we have, again, all of this, let me remind everybody, all of this so far has been established through logical deduction. We have not relied on any sort of probabilistic arguments or anything like that. Whether there's a Big Bang or not, that's irrelevant. There's the fact that the universe begins or not is not part of this argument, right? So through simple logical deduction, is it possible that there are only conditioned realities, or is there at least one unconditioned reality? And if you prove that the conditioned reality scenario only is false, then the unconditioned reality scenario is true, then you simply logically deduce what an unconditioned reality is. And that's what leads you to this conclusion, that there is one single, simple, unique, immaterial, eternal, and unbounded, unconditioned reality, or in Ibn Sina's terms, necessary being. There's one of them, and it has all these properties. And these are not really properties. If you think about it, one, single, simple, unique, immaterial, eternal, unbounded, these are all negations, right? This is all the negation of limitation from this reality. It would mean that if there's one unconditioned reality, all other realities, and it doesn't matter what they are. Again, if you want to be very skeptical, pretend that our universe is in a simulation that exists in another universe, and there's 10 levels of simulation. Let's take that, for example. It doesn't matter how many simulations there are. It doesn't matter if there's a billion other universes. It doesn't matter if there are parallel realities. Accept all of it. At the end of the day, there's one unconditioned reality, and then everything else is a conditioned reality, no matter how vast it could be, no matter how complicated. Everything else is a conditioned reality. So there's one unconditioned reality and there's multiple conditioned realities. And it would also mean, if one takes this argument on board, all the conditioned realities, no matter what they are, again, you can blow it up to the most complex structure of reality. Whatever the conditioned realities are, through whatever chains of causation we have, and they're probably very complicated, all conditioned realities depend on the unconditioned reality to exist. Not directly, but at the end of the day, all these different chains of reality, whatever they are, they will all terminate in the unconditioned reality at every moment. At every moment, at every instant, the unconditioned reality is sustaining and creating the conditioned realities. For this reason, we would not be wrong to say that the unconditioned reality is the continuous creator of all other realities. Robert Spitzer writes about this in his book. He says that the creator, which he defines as the unique, absolutely simple, unrestricted, unconditioned reality itself, must be a continuous creator of all else that is real at every moment it could cease to be real. Analogous, to speak differently, he says that if the creator stopped thinking about us, this is an analogy. If the creator stopped thinking about us, we would literally lapse into nothingness, which is to say, at this very moment, I mean, it's hard to believe, I know, but if this argument is correct, at this very moment, our existence is being sustained and produced through all these chains of conditioned realities. Our existence is being produced and fulfilled and sustained by this one unconditioned reality with every breath we take. A Muslim writer, this is Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan III, he writes in his memoirs, which he wrote in the 1950s, he writes something very, very similar to this. He says, this is from an Islamic perspective, right? Spitzer is a Christian, Aga Khan, Sultan Muhammad Shah is a Muslim, right? For those who don't know, right, the Aga Khan is the hereditary imam of the Ismailis. So he writes that the creation, according to Islam, is not a unique act in a given time, but a perpetual and constant event. And God supports and sustains all existence at every moment by his will and his thought. So he's basically saying that, according to his belief as a Muslim, God is supporting, sustaining all existence at every moment. That's precisely what this argument for unconditioned reality is telling us. That's what the argument is concluding. So again, at this point now, we have shown, either through Ibn Sina's argument or through Hart and Spitzer's argument, that there is one single, simple, unique, immaterial, eternal, unbounded, unconditioned reality, and this unconditioned reality is the continuous creator of everything that exists. Now, many people would probably agree that this corresponds in many theologies to God. This is the concept of God. At least this is the classical concept of God. Now, people can go further on this, right? We've established this at the top through logical deductions, right? Through these arguments. But theologians will go further on this. They'll start with this idea, but they'll go further. So one can offer additional arguments through deductions or inferences from features of the cosmos. And these are all separate arguments. So these are not part of the main argument. So if one considers, and I'm not saying that I agree with all these arguments or that they're good arguments, but they're used. So I just want to summarize them. So one could say, well, the very existence of contingent beings, of the very fact that there are contingent beings or conditioned realities, that proves, again, if you've already proven that there is an unconditioned reality, right? So let's assume, for argument's sake, that there is an unconditioned reality and it is simple, unbounded, and eternal, and so on, that it is this continuous creator. So then you make these further deductions. So one is that whatever this unconditioned reality is, it has creative power, and that the very fact that it is giving existence to conditioned realities, some would say that is an act of compassion, right? To grant existence to that which does not exist is an act of compassion. Some have argued this. Some other people, thinkers, theologians, they look at the natural world and they say, look, there are laws of nature, even the simplest laws of nature. The laws of nature, which are, intelligible behaviors of material things, some argue that this indicates that there is a intelligence behind the laws of nature, because there's no inherent reason why gravity or the law of thermodynamics should exist. There's no inherent reason why these regular behaviors, why there should be laws. Why don't we have a universe that behaves chaotically? So even Einstein, in some of his letters, wrote that one of the miracles of the universe is that there are laws of nature. He said we should expect a chaotic universe. We shouldn't expect this orderly universe. So some have reasoned that because you have order in nature, that indicates that the creator, the unconditioned reality, has intellect, knowledge, and wisdom. Others have looked to the various powers within nature. There's a lot of power within the cosmos, from stars and black holes and so on. And if there's power within the cosmos, the source of that power would be the creator. Therefore, the unconditioned reality is powerful. We also notice, some people argue, that some conditioned realities or some contingent possibilities actually come into existence and many others do not. It's as if some outcomes are being willed over others, and at the cosmic level, some argue that that means the unconditioned reality has will. Another argument, again, these are all separate arguments. They're not part of this main argument. So these are adjunct arguments. Some have argued that the existence, the human beings, we seem to intuit the idea that there are some objective values that we live by. There are some things, some values that seem to be true, no matter how many people agree with it or not. So some have argued that if there are objective values, right, mind-independent moral values or virtues like compassion, justice, truth, goodness, that for these values to be truly objective, they have to be grounded in a transcendent reality. And some have argued that that transcendent reality is the unconditioned reality. So the unconditioned reality, the creator, is the ground of values like goodness, truth, justice, and so on. So these are additional arguments that people have offered. There's another type of argument that's used by more Aristotelian type philosophers. So this is an additional argument. It basically says that since this unconditioned reality is the cause of everything, right? Everything that exists, therefore the powers and the virtues, the qualities that we see in conditioned reality, the qualities we see in the universe, including humans, they are also present in the unconditioned reality. The unconditioned reality has to include qualities like knowledge, intellect, goodness, consciousness, and so forth. So Edward Feser, who's written about this, he's a philosopher, he has said that there's this Aristotelian idea that a cause cannot give what it does not have. So if this unconditioned reality truly is the cause of everything that exists, it's also the cause of justice. It's also the cause of intellect. It's also the cause of goodness. It's also the cause of compassion. And therefore, these qualities, if they exist in the effects, they have to also exist in the cause in some form, and we don't really know what that form is. So Edward Feser argues that the unmoved mover, as the source of all change, is the source of things coming to have the attributes they have. Hence, he has these attributes eminently, if not formally. This includes every power, so he is all-powerful. It also includes intellect and will that humans possess, so he must be said to have intellect and will. So let me just say that people offer additional arguments, reasoning from the features of creation, tell us, to sort of propose that the creator, the unconditioned reality, has these qualities. But there's a big debate over in what sense does the unconditioned reality have these qualities? And in the next two lectures that I do for you, you'll see that Christians and Muslims amongst themselves completely disagree on the nature of divine attributes. There's a huge disagreement on what that really means. So it can get quite complicated. But I just wanted you to know. So even if you ignore these additional things, a simple, unbounded, single, immaterial, eternal, continuous creator, unconditioned reality, you already have the concept of God there. I think you already have it. And certainly when you bring in these attributes, now we're certainly talking about the concept of God. The unconditioned reality is what theologians and religious philosophers call God. Now, is it what common believers think about God? Probably not, but that's okay, because even within each religion, there are many different understandings of what God is. So there's certainly a species, a subset of theistic belief in God that corresponds to this concept of the unconditioned reality, which, as we've talked about today, can be grounded through some philosophical arguments. Now, based on what I shared, let's go back to that first slide where we had all these reasons against the existence of God. And I think based on what I've presented, one could easily respond to these. Now, at the end of the day, although I've shared two arguments with you, are they effective? I mean, people have different views on this. Each person has to decide for themselves whether these are good arguments or not. I showed only two arguments. There are dozens of arguments for the existence of God. I only showed two. And the two that I showed, there are many intelligent, rational, thinking people, philosophers, scientists, academics, who think they're not good arguments. There are many people who are not persuaded by these arguments, and that's fine. There's many people who are persuaded by these arguments. So you'll find people on both sides. I think, though, my goal here today was not to prove to you whether the arguments are good or bad. I think everybody should make their own decision on that. But my goal was to present the arguments cogently. My goal was to make the arguments understandable, and whatever I present from any religious tradition, I try to present the best version of it. I don't try to present a weak version of it. So that's what I try to do, and I think based on what was said, one could respond to these common objections, and here's what it would be, right, based on what was said. So belief in the existence of God is a matter of blind faith. Well, I mean, historically, there are centuries of philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Are they good arguments? That really depends on what you think. Somebody could say they're bad arguments, but it's certainly not a matter of blind faith for many people. God cannot be scientifically proven. I think that's true. I think God cannot be scientifically proven. I think there are many things that can't be scientifically proven that we take as true. The scientific method also cannot be scientifically proven. With so much evil and suffering in the world, God does not exist. I think that this objection has a lot of emotional force, but it does not negate the contingency of things. Furthermore, some have said that if you want to talk about evil as an objective thing and good as an objective value, one could argue from the objectivity of good and evil that there has to be a transcendent ground for that value, which could be God for some people. Quantum physics shows some things are uncaused. Not exactly true. In quantum physics, they have, for example, talked about there are virtual particles that pop into existence, but they don't come out of nothing. They come out of a quantum field. They depend on quantum fields. And there are many events in quantum physics that cannot be determined, like they can't be predicted. So those are indeterminate. This is all called indeterminism, but that does not mean uncaused, right? Indeterminate and uncaused they're not the same thing conceptually. If everything has a cause, who caused God? That's very interesting. Now, here's the thing. If God is defined as a necessary being or an unconditioned reality, then the necessary being is uncaused. So by definition, there cannot be a cause. If, however, someone does not define God as the necessary being, if there's a different definition of God, then it could be that God was caused by the necessary being. So that's an interesting idea. Stephen Hawking's objection that the universe, that gravity creates the universe or the universe created itself. So here's the problem. If there's no universe, you don't really have gravity. Gravity and other laws of physics, they're not actual entities, right? They're not actual powers. Laws of nature are descriptions of how material things behave. That's how I and many people understand laws. So you can't have laws unless there's already things that are obeying the laws. Now, the universe can't create itself, I would say, from nothing, because firstly, something cannot exist before it exists. I can't create myself. If I created myself, I have to already exist to create myself. Furthermore, some will argue, as I mentioned, that the law-like behavior of material things indicates a guiding intelligence. So some could say that, okay, even if gravity is this ultimate law that has always been here, why does it exist? Why is there law-like behavior like gravity? There's no inherent reason why material things should obey any laws. So some would argue, I'm not saying I would argue it, but some would argue that the law-like behavior of matter is due to the fact that there is a guiding cosmic intellect causing that behavior to happen. So the laws of nature arguments can work both ways. Somebody has said, if the universe is eternal and infinite in the past, so there's no Big Bang, there's no need to posit a God. Good objection, but a temporally infinite universe is still contingent, in a sense. Why? Well, the universe is this collection of physical reality, right? Matter, energy, all these processes. Like that's what we call the universe, and it's constantly changing. It has dimensions, spatial dimensions. There's parts of the universe are finite. Even if it always existed, the argument from contingent existence or conditioned realities, the argument still stands, because at every, even if this existence is every moment, there's an infinite amount of time, at every slice of time, there's a hierarchy of conditioned realities and dependence. And at every slice of time, the chain of conditioned realities depends on the unconditioned reality. So you actually sort of need it more. I mean, the argument becomes stronger if the universe is infinite. Someone has said there's no time before the Big Bang, so there's no possible way for God to create the universe. Again, the two arguments I shared here are not dependent on the Big Bang. We don't need a Big Bang. The Big Bang is irrelevant. But even if there is a Big Bang, let's say time began, 13 billion years ago. The unconditioned reality, the necessary being, transcends time. It's creating, it's sustaining everything beyond time. So the causal activity of the unconditioned reality is simultaneous with the existence of conditioned realities. And that there's an earlier slide where I explained that. So you guys can check that out. So again, were these arguments effective? I don't know. I think one has to really go back and examine the assumptions made for both of these arguments. And those assumptions are this. There's an assumption made that contingent existence or conditioned realities depend on causes or other realities. So the assumption being made is this idea of causation. That is the key assumption, that a contingent thing depends on a cause to exist. That's the assumption. Now, what's an objection against this against the assumption? Well, Immanuel Kant, I think he made the argument. He once said that causation only applies in the physical world, and it does not apply beyond the physical, beyond nature. That's what Kant said. That was his objection. Some others have used that too. I don't think it's a good objection, because if you say the causation only exists in the natural world and it doesn't exist beyond the natural world, how could you know that? How could we know that causation doesn't operate outside the natural world? Rather, a better strategy would be to say, let's make no assumption on whether there is causation beyond the natural world or not. Let's not even go there. Rather, if one finds that the natural world itself is contingent, then it depends on something beyond the natural world, and therefore causation is in play. So that's the thing. This argument, it doesn't really assume universal causation at all. In fact, the argument itself, until the end, it never really makes a distinction between the physical and the non-physical world. That distinction really only comes at the end of the argument. So at the end of the day, the key question, like whether you agree with the arguments or you don't agree with the arguments, or whether you're on the fence, the key question is this, and it's a philosophical question. Why, we look around and things exist. And so why does anything exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And ultimately, I think we have two possible answers. I think the biggest alternative to classical theism, which is what I presented, I think the strongest alternative would be to say things simply exist. It's a brute fact, and there's no explanation, there's no cause. So the alternative would be, there are conditioned realities. Like, let's admit that there are conditioned realities, and there are contingent existence. They exist, fine. But it's a brute fact. It just is. There's no cause. So what you end up with is what David Bentley Hart calls absolute contingency, uncaused effects, and unconditioned conditionalities. That, I think, is the alternative to this whole thing. You just say the universe exists, and that's all. That's all we can know. It's just a brute fact. There's no explanation. So we're not saying that there is an explanation, but we don't know. We're saying that it just is. The end. I think those are the choices. It's either brute fact or some necessary existence or unconditioned being. Robert Lawrence Kuhn, I'll end with something he wrote. I think he summarizes this question very well. So he's actually a very well-known corporate strategist who's done a lot of work in China. He appears on TV, on CNN, Business Network type stuff a lot. He's also taken an interest in these deeper questions. He created a whole show on PBS called Closer to the Truth, where he interviews philosophers, scientists, theologians. They're all on YouTube. You can check it out. It's quite interesting. You've seen him in class, actually, in some of the videos. So he had wrote an article called Levels of Nothing several years ago, and I think he summarizes this. He did this whole study about why is there something rather than nothing, and in the end he shares his thoughts, and this is what he says. Robert Lawrence Kuhn. He says, setting aside my taxonomy and consulting my gut, I come to only two kinds of answers. The first, this is the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? The first is that there can be no answer. Existence is a brute fact without explanation. So that's his first answer. Maybe some of you think that's the answer. There are some days that, it seems that existence is just a brute fact. And this is a very cold, a cold universe in a sense. The second, he says, so there's two kinds of answers. The first is that it's a brute fact. The second is that at the primordial beginning, explanatorily and timelessly prior to time, something was self-existing. The essence of this something necessitated its existence, such that non-existence to it would be as inherently impossible as physical immortality to us is factually impossible. So the second choice that Robert Lawrence Kuhn gives us is that there must have been, before time and space, there must have been a self-existing reality whose essence necessitated its existence. In other words, a necessary being, an unconditioned reality, that which exists independently and self-sufficiency. And that's the second choice, that why is there something rather than nothing? Well, this necessary being, unconditioned reality, that is the primordial existence, and sort of everything somehow came from that. So that's what he leaves you with, right? And I think those are the two options. Now, let's say for whatever reason, if you are convinced, if you take the idea of the necessary being, unconditioned reality seriously, if you think that is the case, and if you accept that that is the concept of God, and for many, remember, for many religious thinkers, probably the greatest religious thinkers in Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam, if you just look at those four traditions, and even in Baha'i tradition, Sikhism, and Greek thought, I think you'll find widespread agreement that the concept of God is the concept of unconditioned reality. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that the idea of God as unconditioned reality is shared across these traditions. So if one was on board with that, how do you go from that idea of God as the necessary being to the idea of religion or religious practice? Because some may ask, okay, well, this is very nice. If there is some unconditioned reality, that's the source of reality, that's sustaining everything in every moment. Like, so what? Like, what impact does that have on our life? It's a very valid question. But I wanted to share one answer to that question. This is from Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan III, right? He is the 48th Imam of the Shia Ismaili Muslims. He has written some public writings which are quite interesting, and he sort of makes this point in an interview he gives. So he was asked, like how what is happiness? And he begins by saying a man must be one with God to be happy. And he goes on to explain. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he says, referring to the existence of God, he says, how we stand this instant and every instant toward Him, toward God, matters to us more than anything else in the universe. Why is that the case? Because if you take seriously this idea that God, unconditioned reality, is creating and sustaining your existence and all existence at every moment, then you could say, a person's relationship or attitude or orientation toward this unconditioned reality would matter, would affect whether that person is happy or not. So the Aga Khan says, how we stand this instant and every instant toward Him matters more to us than anything else in the universe. This is the fundamental question. Are you in harmony with God? If you are happy. So I think this is the key. This is the key issue. If one accepts the idea of God as the unconditioned reality, necessary being, creating and sustaining all things at every moment, the next question would be to each person: is there a way to live and be in the world in a way that's in harmony with that unconditioned reality? And if there is an optimal way to live and be and act in the world and think in the world that's in harmony with the creative activity of this unconditioned reality, then one ought to live that way for their own happiness. And I think this is where notions of religion, religious practice, because ultimately what these different religions are claiming to do is they are claiming to offer people a way of life that brings each person into harmony with God, and thus brings happiness to that person. So I think this is that connecting line between this sort of philosophy and theology and, more sort of everyday lived religion. But that is a topic for another time. So I will conclude it over here. I know this has been quite lengthy, but that we had a lot to go through. Um, so again, if we sort of, I hope this was a helpful talk for everybody. We can go back to the lecture objectives, right? What we were trying to do, trying to situate the issue of the existence of God within, contemporary debates. We wanted to show two arguments that are used by Muslims and Christians about the existence of God. And something for you to all think about is based on what you heard, right? Remember, Christians and Muslims use both these arguments. So are Christians and Muslims talking about the same God? Right? That is the question. So anyway, I will leave it at that. Thank you all very much for joining us. You have a copy of the slides, so you can go back and check out, revisit things, because this could be quite difficult at times. And remember, the next two lectures will show up later in the week. We'll briefly look at how did Christians and Muslims further interpret the concept of God, within their own traditions, and what are the different ways among themselves that Christians and Muslims have thought about the concept of God. They have this starting point, which I showed you, but from this one starting point, Muslim theology and Christian theology, they proceed in different directions. So that's what we'll see. So anyway, thank you all and have a good night.